What's up, history buffs? Today we're diving into the question nobody dares to ask. Julius Caesar, the real story they're hiding. And I'm not talking about some conspiracy theory nonsense. I'm talking about the brutal, bloody, absolutely insane truth that your high school history teacher conveniently glossed over because it would make Shakespeare look like a Disney movie. Forget everything you think you know about this guy. Forget the noble Roman general. Forget the tragic hero who got backstabbed by his best friend. The real Julius Caesar? He was basically the ancient world's equivalent of a mafia boss who somehow convinced everyone he was running for president. And the story of how he pulled it off is way more twisted than any Netflix series you've binged. Here's what they don't tell you in school. Caesar didn't just cross the Rubicon and become dictator. Oh no, guys. This man spent decades systematically destroying the Roman Republic from the inside, using every dirty trick in the book. Bribery, blackmail, strategic marriages, and enough political manipulation to make House of Cards look like amateur hour. And the craziest part? He did it all while convincing people he was their savior. Smash that like button if you want the raw, unfiltered truth about how one man can literally break an entire civilization, and let me know in the comments. How far do you think human ambition can actually go before it destroys everything around it? But here's the kicker that'll blow your mind. Caesar's rise to power wasn't some grand master plan. It was a series of increasingly desperate moves by a man drowning in debt, running from his enemies, and willing to burn down the world's greatest empire just to save his own skin. The guy was basically gambling with other people's lives on a scale that would make modern politicians blush. You see, when Caesar was born in 100 BC, Rome wasn't the mighty empire you think of. It was a republic. Think of it like if Washington, D.C. was run by the most cutthroat politicians imaginable, except they all carried swords, and assassination was considered a legitimate political strategy. The Roman Senate wasn't some dignified governing body. It was more like a gladiator arena where the weapons were words, bribes, and occasionally actual knives. Real talk. This next part is going to sound absolutely bonkers, but stick with me. Caesar grew up in a world where being politically ambitious didn't just mean you might lose an election. It meant you might literally lose your head. The previous generation had seen civil wars that made Game of Thrones look tame, with Roman generals marching on Rome itself and turning the streets into rivers of blood. And young Julius? He looked at this chaos and thought, you know what? I bet I can do this better. The audacity alone should have gotten him killed on the spot. Hold up. Before we continue, drop a comment if you think Caesar was a genius who saved Rome or a power-hungry maniac who destroyed it. Because by the end of this video, you're going to realize that question is way more complicated than anyone wants to admit. The first clue that Caesar was different came when he was just a teenager. Most rich Roman kids would play it safe, maybe buy a nice villa, marry well, and coast on their family name. But Caesar? This madman decided to pick a fight with Sulla, literally the most powerful and dangerous man in Rome, a dictator who had a habit of making his enemies disappear in very creative ways. Why would an 18-year-old do something so monumentally stupid? Because Caesar had already figured out the one truth that would define his entire life. In Rome, you either played the game to win everything, or you ended up as someone else's footnote. There was no middle ground. No participation trophies, just power or death. And folks, what happened next set the stage for everything that followed. The conquests, the civil war, the assassination, and ultimately, the fall of the Roman Republic itself. Because when Caesar chose to fight instead of submit, he didn't just change his own destiny. He changed the course of Western civilization forever. But here's where things get really wild. Plot twist incoming. Caesar's first brush with death wasn't on some battlefield or in the Senate. It was because he refused to divorce his wife. Yeah, you heard that right. This teenage hothead almost got himself killed over what amounted to ancient Roman marriage drama. Here's the deal. Sulla, Rome's current dictator and certified psychopath, had a simple request. He wanted Caesar to divorce his wife Cornelia because her dad had been on the wrong side of the Civil War. It was basically Sulla's way of saying, "Hey kid, prove you're loyal to me by throwing your wife under the bus." Any sane person would have said, Sure thing, Mr. Dictator. Whatever you want. But Caesar? This absolute madman looked at the most powerful person in the known world and said, "Nah, I'm good." The audacity. The sheer, unhinged audacity. Sulla's response was predictable. He stripped Caesar of everything. His inheritance, his priesthood, his wife's dowry. Basically turned him into ancient Rome's most wanted teenager. Caesar had to flee Rome and live like a fugitive in the mountains, constantly looking over his shoulder for assassins. But here's the thing that nobody talks about, and this is where you start to see the real Caesar emerging. While he's hiding in caves, dodging death squads, this guy is already planning his comeback. He's not just surviving, he's networking, making connections with other exiles, other enemies of Sulla, building the foundation of what would become his political machine. Real talk, if you're still with me, you're about to witness the most insane character development in history. Because when Sulla finally died and Caesar could return to Rome, he didn't come back broken or humble. He came back hungry. And the first thing he did, he sued Sulla's allies for corruption. Not quietly, not diplomatically. He went full nuclear, dragging some of the most powerful people in Rome to court. The kid who'd been hiding in caves just months before was now publicly humiliating former dictators' cronies. The Roman elite must have been like, "Who is this guy?" Because here's Caesar, early 20s, technically bankrupt, with zero military experience, taking on senators who had been playing politics since before he was born. It should have been political suicide. But Caesar had figured out something revolutionary. The Roman people were tired of the same old corrupt politicians. They wanted someone who would actually fight for them instead of just making promises during election season. Sound familiar, folks? So Caesar didn't just defend himself in these corruption trials. He turned them into performances. He would stand up in court and absolutely eviscerate these powerful men, exposing their dirty deals, their bribes, their complete contempt for ordinary Romans. The crowds ate it up. Pause the video right now, and guess what happens next? Here's this young nobody, making enemies of everyone who matters in Rome. How do you think the establishment responds to someone threatening their entire system? If you guessed they try to destroy him, you're absolutely right. But if you think they succeeded, you clearly haven't been paying attention to how this story ends. Because Caesar had learned the most important lesson in politics. It doesn't matter how powerful your enemies are if you can make the people love you more than they fear them. And Caesar, this guy was about to become the master of that game. But first, he needed money. Lots of it. And the way he got it reveals just how far Caesar was willing to go to win. Buckle up, Buttercup, because what Caesar did next makes modern political corruption look like a church bake sale. This man didn't just bend the rules. He took them out back and executed them with a rusty sword. Here's the situation. Caesar wants to run for higher office. But Roman politics literally ran on bribery. You couldn't get elected dog catcher without greasing the right palms, and Caesar was broker than a college student eating ramen for the third week straight. So what does our boy do? He goes to Marcus Crassus, basically the Jeff Bezos of ancient Rome, except with more slaves and fewer delivery trucks. Crassus was so rich that when people said rich as Crassus, they meant it literally. This guy once said that nobody could call themselves wealthy unless they could afford to maintain their own army. Just casual billionaire things, you know? But here's where it gets absolutely wild. Caesar doesn't just ask for a loan. Oh no, that would be too simple. He convinces Crassus to become his personal ATM in exchange for political favors down the line. Basically, Caesar sold his soul to the richest man in Rome before he even had any real power to sell. The amounts we're talking about are insane. Caesar borrowed so much money that if he didn't win his next election, he wouldn't just be bankrupt. He'd probably be dead. We're talking about debt that would make your student loans look like pocket change. This man mortgaged his entire future on a bet that he could climb high enough in Roman politics to pay it all back. And everyone knew it. The Roman elite were literally betting on when Caesar would crash and burn. They had him figured for just another ambitious idiot who'd borrowed his way into oblivion. But Caesar had a secret weapon they didn't see coming. He actually gave a damn about putting on a show for the common people. While other politicians were throwing boring, dignified ceremonies, Caesar was throwing the ancient equivalent of Super Bowl halftime shows. When he became a dial, basically the guy in charge of public entertainment, Caesar didn't just organize the usual gladiator games. This madman put on spectacles so elaborate and expensive that people talked about them for decades. We're talking about 320 pairs of gladiators fighting at once, exotic animals from across the empire, theatrical productions that made Broadway look low budget. Let me know in the comments if you think Caesar was a visionary or just completely reckless, because, honestly, it's hard to tell the difference sometimes. The craziest part? While Caesar was bankrupting himself on these public games, he was also secretly investigating every dirty politician in Rome. He wasn't just entertaining the masses. He was building detailed files on everyone's corruption, their illegal deals, their secret alliances. The man was basically running his own ancient FBI while juggling flaming debt. And this is where you start to see the real genius emerge. Caesar realized that in Roman politics, information was power. While everyone else was focused on making backroom deals, Caesar was collecting blackmail material on half the Senate. He turned every dinner party into an intelligence-gathering operation. But here's the thing that blew everyone's minds. Caesar wasn't using this information to destroy people quietly. He was saving it, building up this massive arsenal of political ammunition for when he really needed it. The patience this required is absolutely terrifying when you think about it, because Caesar had figured out something that would define politics for the next 2,000 years. It's not enough to be corrupt. You have to be more corrupt than everyone else, but also more popular. You have to out-dirty the dirty politicians, while somehow convincing people you're actually the clean one. And this strategy? It was about to pay off in ways that would shock even Caesar himself, because while he was playing this long game, something happened that nobody saw coming. Not even him. The pirates made a very, very big mistake. All right, everyone, gather around, because this next story is so absolutely bonkers that if it was in a movie, you'd roll your eyes and say it was too unrealistic. But it actually happened, and it shows you exactly the kind of psychopath we're dealing with here. So Caesar is sailing across the Mediterranean, probably counting his debts and wondering how he's going to pay back Crassus without ending up as fish food, when suddenly, boom, pirates. Not the fun Johnny Depp kind. The "we will literally torture you to death for entertainment" kind. Now, normal people in this situation would be terrified, right? Maybe try to negotiate quietly, hope for the best, pray to whatever gods they believed in. But Caesar, this absolute madman, does something that probably gave the pirates nightmares for the rest of their lives. They demand a ransom of 20 talents of silver. That's roughly 1,500 pounds of pure silver, enough money to buy a small army. Caesar's response? He laughs in their faces and tells them they're insulting him. He demands they raise the ransom to 50 talents because apparently being kidnapped by pirates wasn't humiliating enough for his ego. Hold up, let that sink in for a second. This guy is literally tied up by murderous criminals, and he's arguing that they're not charging enough for his kidnapping. The sheer audacity is mind-blowing, but it gets worse. While they're waiting for the ransom money to arrive, Caesar doesn't cower in a corner like a normal hostage. He starts treating the pirates like his personal servants. He tells them to be quiet when he's trying to nap. He makes them listen to his poetry and speeches. When they don't applaud enthusiastically enough, he calls them illiterate barbarians to their faces. The pirates are probably thinking, did we accidentally kidnap a crazy person? Is this guy having some kind of breakdown? And here's the kicker. Caesar keeps joking with them about how he's going to crucify them all once he gets free. Just casual death threats during breakfast. Pass the bread, and by the way, I'm going to nail you to a cross and watch you die slowly. The pirates thought it was hilarious. They're laughing, thinking this Roman aristocrat is just trying to save face with empty threats. Big mistake. Huge mistake. Because the second, and I mean the absolute second, Caesar gets ransomed and sets foot on dry land, he doesn't go home to recover from his traumatic experience. He doesn't file a complaint with the Roman authorities and hope someone else deals with it. This maniac goes straight to the nearest Roman naval base, grabs a fleet of ships, and goes hunting for those pirates. And when he finds them, he doesn't just arrest them. He doesn't demand they pay him back. Caesar crucifies every single one of them, exactly like he promised. Real talk. This next part reveals something terrifying about Caesar's psychology. Before he crucifies them, he has their throats cut first as an act of mercy because they'd been relatively kind to him during his captivity. That's Caesar's version of being nice, folks. A slightly less agonizing execution. Think about what this story reveals. Caesar turned a humiliating kidnapping into a demonstration of power. He made pirates think he was their friend, then hunted them down like animals. He kept his word about murdering them, but framed it as mercy. This is the mind of someone who thinks 3 moves ahead in every situation. And the Roman people, they absolutely loved it. Here was a guy who didn't just survive pirate kidnapping, he turned it into his origin story. He made himself the hero of his own revenge tale. But what nobody realized at the time was that Caesar had just discovered his true calling. He wasn't meant to be just another corrupt politician in Rome. He was meant to be a conqueror. And his next target was going to make those pirates look like amateur hour. And this is where our story takes a hard left turn into absolute insanity. Because Caesar, fresh off his pirate-murdering publicity stunt, decides he needs a bigger stage. And by bigger stage, I mean he's about to commit what amounts to genocide against an entire civilization just to pay his credit card bills. Welcome to the Gallic Wars, folks. 8 years of Caesar turning modern-day France, Belgium, and parts of Germany into his personal piggy bank, all while convincing Rome he was protecting them from barbarian invasion. It's like if someone invaded Canada claiming they were preventing a maple syrup shortage. But here's what they don't teach you in school. Caesar didn't go to Gaul as some noble Roman general spreading civilization. He went there as a desperate politician drowning in debt who needed military victories and treasure to survive politically. The man was basically running a protection racket on a continental scale. Caesar owed so much money to Crassus and other creditors that if he came back to Rome without massive wealth and military glory, he wouldn't just lose his political career, he'd lose his life. Roman law was very clear. Former magistrates could be prosecuted for corruption the moment they stepped down from office. And Caesar had been more corrupt than a congressman at a lobbyist convention. So what does our boy do? He convinces the Senate to give him governorship of Gaul for an unprecedented 5 years. That's like being given the keys to Fort Knox and told, go nuts, but make it look legitimate. The Gauls, by the way, weren't some savage barbarians waiting to be conquered. These were sophisticated tribes with their own cultures, technologies, and political systems. They had cities, trade networks, and armies that could go toe-to-toe with Rome when they actually worked together. Caesar wasn't civilizing anyone, he was robbing them. But Caesar was a master of propaganda before the word even existed. Every winter, he'd write detailed reports to Rome describing these massive barbarian threats that only he could handle. He made the Gallic tribes sound like they were constantly plotting to march on Rome and burn it to the ground. Drop a comment if you think Caesar actually believed his own propaganda or if he knew he was completely making it up. Because the evidence suggests he was basically the ancient equivalent of someone starting wars to distract from domestic problems. And the methods Caesar used? Guys, this is where things get really dark. When the Gallic tribes tried to resist his protection, Caesar didn't just defeat them in battle. He made examples. At Alesia, he starved an entire city into submission. At Avaricum, he allowed his soldiers to massacre virtually every man, woman, and child in the city. We're talking about 40,000 people slaughtered in a single day. Caesar's own writings estimate he killed over 1 million Gauls and enslaved another 1 million. That's not conquest. That's demographic replacement. He literally depopulated entire regions and sold the survivors into slavery to pay his debts. But here's the most twisted part. Caesar wrote about all of this himself, in third person, like he was some objective historian documenting someone else's campaigns. Caesar did this, Caesar did that, as if he was writing about a character in a story rather than confessing to mass murder. The psychological manipulation here is staggering. By writing in third person, Caesar distanced himself from the brutality while also making himself the hero of his own narrative. He turned war crimes into adventure stories. And it worked. Back in Rome, people were reading Caesar's dispatches like they were binge-watching their favorite Netflix series. Caesar the character became more popular than Caesar the person. He created his own mythology while he was still living it. Real talk. If you're still with me, you're witnessing the birth of something truly terrifying. A politician who understood that perception matters more than reality, that a good story can justify any atrocity, and that people will cheer for mass murder if you frame it as protecting civilization. But Caesar made one critical miscalculation. While he was busy committing genocide for profit in Gaul, his political enemies back in Rome weren't sitting around waiting for him to come home rich and famous. They were planning something that would force Caesar into the most desperate gamble of his life. Plot twist incoming. And this is where Caesar's entire house of cards almost comes crashing down. Because while our boy was out playing conqueror and writing fan fiction about himself, the Roman Senate finally grew a backbone and decided to do something about their Caesar problem. Here's what was happening behind the scenes. Cato the Younger, basically the ancient world's equivalent of that one guy who actually reads the terms and conditions, had been keeping detailed records of every illegal thing Caesar had done. And folks, that was a very long list. Bribery? Check. Illegal use of public funds? Double check. Starting wars without Senate approval? Triple check with a cherry on top. Cato had enough evidence to put Caesar away for about 17 lifetimes, and he was just waiting for Caesar's governorship to expire so he could drag him to court. But Caesar had one ace up his sleeve. He could run for consul again while still governor of Gaul. Roman law said you couldn't prosecute a sitting magistrate, so if Caesar could seamlessly transition from governor to consul, he'd be legally untouchable. It was like political immunity with a loophole you could drive a chariot through. The Senate's response? Oh, hell no. They passed a law requiring Caesar to give up his command and return to Rome as a private citizen before he could run for consul. Basically, they wanted him to spend at least a few months as a regular person who could be arrested, tried, and probably executed for his crimes. Now, any reasonable person would look at this situation and think, maybe I should negotiate. Maybe I should compromise. Maybe I should not start a civil war that destroys the Roman Republic. But Caesar wasn't reasonable people. Caesar was Caesar. And this is where you see the true genius of Caesar's long-term strategy. Remember all that debt he'd accumulated? All those favors he owed? All those soldiers he'd enriched in Gaul? Suddenly, none of that was a weakness. It was his army. Caesar's legions weren't just loyal to Rome, they were loyal to Caesar personally. He'd made them rich beyond their wildest dreams with Gallic gold and slaves. These weren't patriotic Roman soldiers serving the Republic. These were Caesar's personal death cult, willing to follow him anywhere because he'd literally changed their lives. Pause the video right now and think about this. Caesar had spent years turning the Roman military into his personal mafia. Every victory in Gaul, every distribution of loot, every promotion he handed out, it was all building toward this moment when he'd need them to choose between Rome and him. But even Caesar knew that crossing the Rubicon, the river that marked the boundary between Gaul and Italy, meant there was no going back. Roman law was crystal clear. Bringing an army into Italy was treason punishable by death. The moment Caesar's soldiers set foot across that river, they'd all be enemies of the state. So Caesar did what Caesar always did when faced with an impossible choice. He found a way to make it someone else's fault. On January 10th, 49 BC, Caesar stood on the banks of the Rubicon with his army behind him. And according to his own account, he didn't march across like some conquering hero. He agonized. He hesitated. He made it look like the Senate had forced his hand by refusing to negotiate. But here's what Caesar doesn't mention in his version of events. He'd been planning this moment for years. The debt, the military loyalty, the propaganda campaign, everything had been building toward this manufactured crisis where Caesar could present himself as the victim while literally destroying the Roman Republic. When Caesar finally crossed that river, he reportedly said, "The die is cast." But what he really meant was, I've been rigging this game for so long that I forgot there were supposed to be rules. And the craziest part? It worked. Caesar's civil war would destroy everything Rome had built over centuries, kill hundreds of thousands of people, and end the Roman Republic forever. But Caesar? Caesar would become a god. Buckle up, because what happens next is the most insane military campaign in human history. Caesar doesn't just invade Italy. He basically speedruns the conquest of the Roman Empire with a strategy so audacious it makes modern military commanders weep with envy. Here's the situation. Caesar has maybe 20,000 soldiers. The Roman Republic has access to legions across the entire Mediterranean. On paper, this should be David versus Goliath, except David forgot to bring his slingshot and Goliath has nuclear weapons. But Caesar had figured out something revolutionary about warfare. Speed beats strength, and psychology beats numbers. While Pompey, the Senate's chosen champion, was mobilizing massive armies, Caesar was moving so fast that he captured cities before their defenders even knew he was coming. The genius of Caesar's strategy wasn't just military. It was psychological warfare on a scale nobody had ever attempted. He didn't sack cities or massacre populations like he did in Gaul. Instead, he practiced what he called clemency. He pardoned enemies, returned property, and treated captured senators like honored guests. Now you might think, oh, how noble of Caesar. Wrong. This was manipulation at its finest. Caesar knew that every act of mercy would be reported back to Rome, making him look like the reasonable one while his enemies looked like the bloodthirsty warmongers who'd started the whole conflict. Let me know in the comments if you think Caesar's clemency was genuine or just brilliant propaganda, because honestly, with this guy it's impossible to tell where strategy ends and personality begins. But here's where it gets absolutely wild. Pompey, arguably one of Rome's greatest generals, makes the baffling decision to abandon Italy completely. He retreats to Greece, thinking he'll build up a massive army and starve Caesar out. It's like evacuating your own country and hoping the invader gets bored and goes home. Caesar's response? Cool, thanks for the free empire. Within 2 months, Caesar controlled all of Italy, Spain, and most of Rome's western territories. Pompey's brilliant strategic retreat had basically handed Caesar half the known world without a fight. And the Roman people's reaction? They welcomed Caesar like a liberating hero. After decades of civil wars, political corruption, and economic instability, here was a guy who promised to fix everything and actually seemed to have the power to do it. But Caesar still had one massive problem. He was broke again. Conquering Italy is expensive, and Caesar had spent everything he'd looted from Gaul just getting to this point. So what does our financially irresponsible dictator do? He breaks into the Roman treasury. Real talk. This next part shows you exactly how far Caesar had fallen from any pretense of legality. The Roman treasury was sacred, guarded by religious law and centuries of tradition. When Caesar demanded access, the treasury official literally said he'd rather die than hand over the keys. Caesar's response was peak Caesar. That can be arranged. He didn't kill the guy, that would have been bad publicity. Instead, he had his soldiers break down the doors while Caesar stood there looking sad and reluctant, like someone had forced him to rob his own government. The psychological manipulation here is staggering. Caesar robbed Rome blind while making it look like he had no choice, then used Rome's own money to finance his war against Rome. It's like borrowing someone's credit card to hire a hitman to kill them, then acting surprised when they object. And with the treasury's gold backing him, Caesar turned his attention to the real prize, hunting down Pompey and ending this civil war once and for all. What happened next would either make Caesar the undisputed master of the Roman world or get him killed in the most spectacular failure in military history. The showdown was set. 2 of Rome's greatest generals fighting for the soul of civilization itself. Winner takes everything. Loser gets crucified. But first, Caesar had to cross another body of water that would become almost as famous as the Rubicon. What's about to happen next is so ridiculously over the top that it sounds like something out of a superhero movie. Caesar, chasing Pompey across the Mediterranean, decides to personally sail into a massive storm because apparently nearly dying once per major campaign wasn't enough for this absolute madman. Here's the setup. Caesar's army is split between Italy and Greece. Pompey has naval superiority, and winter storms are making the crossing basically suicidal. Any sane military commander would wait for spring, build more ships, maybe try some diplomacy. But Caesar? Caesar looks at the worst sailing conditions imaginable and thinks, you know what would be fun? Let's do this right now. So Caesar disguises himself as a regular messenger because nothing says stealth mission like the most famous man in the Roman world trying to go incognito and orders a small boat to take him across the Adriatic Sea in the middle of a winter storm. The ship captain takes one look at the weather and basically says, "Are you insane? We'll all die out there." Caesar's response, "Don't worry about dying. You're carrying Caesar. Fortune never abandons Caesar." The sheer arrogance. This man actually believed he was too important for physics to kill him. And here's the kicker. They almost do die. The storm is so violent that the boat starts breaking apart. Waves are crashing over the deck, and even Caesar's legendary confidence starts to crack. But instead of turning back like a normal person, Caesar doubles down. He reveals his identity to the terrified crew and basically orders the storm to calm down through sheer force of personality. Spoiler alert, storms don't care about your political achievements. They had to turn back, and Caesar nearly drowned because he thought natural disasters would make exceptions for dictators. But this story reveals something crucial about Caesar's psychology at this point. He genuinely believed he was invincible. 8 years of victories in Gaul, conquering Italy without a real fight, robbing the treasury without consequences. Caesar had started drinking his own Kool-Aid. He thought he was chosen by the gods. Hold up. Before we continue, tell me in the comments, do you think Caesar was genuinely convinced of his own divine protection, or was this all just psychological warfare against his enemies? Because what happens next suggests even Caesar wasn't sure anymore. When Caesar finally makes it to Greece with his full army, he faces the moment of truth. Pompey has assembled the largest Roman army ever put together. Legions from across the empire, plus allies, plus naval superiority, plus defensive positions. On paper, Caesar is about to get annihilated. The Battle of Pharsalus in 48 BC should have ended with Caesar's head on a spike. Pompey had every advantage. More soldiers, better position, supply lines, and he was fighting to preserve the Roman Republic against a traitor. This was supposed to be where justice prevailed and the good guys won. Instead, it became the greatest upset in military history. Caesar's secret weapon wasn't tactics or strategy. It was pure desperation mixed with the kind of inspirational leadership that makes normal people do impossible things. He told his soldiers that this was it. Win here, and they'd be the richest men in history. Lose, and they'd all be crucified as traitors. But more importantly, Caesar had spent years making his soldiers believe they were special. Not just Roman legionaries, Caesar's legionaries. They weren't fighting for the Republic anymore. They were fighting for their commander who'd made them rich, famous, and feared across the known world. And when the battle started, something incredible happened. Pompey's massive army, despite every advantage, just crumbled. Caesar's veterans, outnumbered 2-1, smashed through Pompey's lines like they were cutting through butter. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Word spread across the Mediterranean that Caesar had defeated the great Pompey with an inferior force. It wasn't just a military victory. It was proof that Caesar really was chosen by fortune, that the gods themselves were on his side. Pompey fled to Egypt, thinking he'd find sanctuary with allies there. But he made one critical miscalculation about how far Caesar's reputation had spread. And this is where our story takes the darkest turn yet, because what happens to Pompey in Egypt reveals just how much Caesar's ruthless pragmatism had infected the entire ancient world. Everyone was learning to think like Caesar now, and that was terrifying. So Pompey arrives in Egypt expecting protection from Ptolemy III, the young pharaoh who technically owed Rome some favors. But Ptolemy's advisors take one look at the situation and make a calculation that would make a mob accountant proud. Pompey alive is a liability, but Pompey dead makes Caesar grateful. They invite Pompey onto a small boat under the pretense of welcoming him to Egypt. The moment he steps aboard, they stab him to death and cut off his head. Then they preserve it in salt to present as a gift to Caesar when he arrives. Because nothing says diplomatic alliance like delivering your enemy's severed head in a box. When Caesar lands in Egypt a few days later, expecting to hunt down his greatest rival, instead he's handed Pompey's head like some kind of twisted room service. And Caesar's reaction? He breaks down crying. Now you might think this shows Caesar had some humanity left in him. Wrong again. Caesar cried because Pompey's death robbed him of his greatest political asset, the chance to publicly forgive his most dangerous enemy. Dead, Pompey became a martyr. Alive and pardoned, he would have been proof of Caesar's legendary clemency. The Egyptians had completely missed the point of Caesar's political strategy. They thought they were helping him by eliminating his rival. Instead, they'd ruined his opportunity for the greatest propaganda victory in Roman history. But Caesar, being Caesar, turned even this setback into an advantage. He declared himself horrified by Pompey's assassination, executed the people responsible, and positioned himself as the defender of Roman honor against barbaric foreigners. It was like being upset that someone else stole your thunder, then using that upset to steal even more thunder. Real talk. This next part is where Caesar's story intersects with one of history's most famous power couples, and it's way more calculated than any romance novel would have you believe. Enter Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh of Egypt, who was currently losing a civil war against her own brother. And Cleopatra, unlike her brother's advisors, immediately understood exactly what kind of man she was dealing with. She didn't just ask Caesar for help. She smuggled herself into his presence wrapped in a carpet, which sounds romantic until you realize it was basically the ancient equivalent of hiding in someone's Amazon delivery to get past their security. Cleopatra knew Caesar's weakness wasn't beautiful women. It was bold, intelligent people who thought like he did, and their alliance, it wasn't love at first sight. It was mutual recognition between two of the most ruthless political minds in history. Cleopatra needed Caesar's legions to win her throne. Caesar needed Egypt's wealth and grain supplies to maintain his empire. Everything else was just excellent public relations. But while Caesar was playing house with Cleopatra in Alexandria, something was happening back in Rome that would eventually destroy everything he'd built. His enemies weren't giving up. They were just getting smarter about how they planned to stop him. Drop a comment if you think Caesar should have stayed in Rome instead of chasing after conquests, because his absence from the capital was about to create the opening his enemies needed. Because while Caesar was busy making himself pharaoh of Egypt and having a kid with Cleopatra, the Roman Senate was quietly recruiting someone who understood Caesar better than anyone else, because they'd watched him destroy the Republic from the inside. Marcus Brutus wasn't just any senator. He was Caesar's protege, his political heir, and possibly his illegitimate son. And Brutus was about to teach Caesar the most brutal lesson in Roman politics. When you base your entire power on personal loyalty, you're only as strong as your weakest friendship. The conspiracy that would end Caesar's life was already forming, and ironically, it was using all the techniques Caesar himself had perfected. Plot twist incoming, and this one's going to blow your mind because the conspiracy to kill Caesar wasn't some desperate last stand by dying Republicans. It was a masterclass in psychological manipulation that used Caesar's own playbook against him. These guys had been taking notes. Here's what's brilliant about the conspiracy. They didn't recruit Caesar's enemies. They recruited his friends. Because Brutus and the other conspirators understood something fundamental about Caesar's psychology. He was addicted to being loved by people he respected. Marcus Brutus wasn't just any senator plotting against Caesar. This guy was basically Caesar's political son, his protege, the person Caesar had groomed to carry on his legacy. Caesar had pardoned Brutus after Pharsalus, promoted him, trusted him with important positions. If Caesar had a weakness, it was his need to believe that intelligent people genuinely admired him, and the conspirators exploited this weakness perfectly. They didn't approach Brutus with threats or bribes. They approached him with philosophy. They convinced him that killing Caesar wasn't murder. It was liberation. They turned assassination into a moral duty, tyrannicide into heroism. The psychological manipulation here is staggering. Remember how Caesar had spent years convincing his soldiers they were special, chosen, part of something greater than themselves? The conspirators did the exact same thing to Brutus. They made him believe he was the hero of the story, destined to save the Republic from a dictator. But here's where it gets really twisted. Brutus probably was Caesar's biological son. Ancient sources hint that Caesar had an affair with Brutus's mother around the time Brutus was conceived. So the conspirators weren't just convincing a protege to kill his mentor. They were potentially convincing a son to kill his father. Real talk. If you're still with me, you're about to witness the most psychologically complex assassination in human history. Because Caesar knew something was coming, the signs were everywhere. Soothsayers were warning him about the Ides of March. His wife Calpurnia was having nightmares about his death. Even the sacrificial animals were showing bad omens, which in Roman culture was basically the gods sending a strongly worded text message saying, "Don't go outside today." But Caesar ignored all of it. Why? Because he'd become so convinced of his own invincibility that he thought warnings of danger were just proof of how important he was. The man's ego had become a suicide weapon. On March 15th, 44 BC, Caesar woke up to his wife begging him not to go to the Senate meeting. The soothsayer reminded him about the Ides of March warning. Even his bodyguards were nervous. Every rational person around Caesar was basically screaming, "This is a trap." Caesar's response. He decided that staying home would make him look weak. This man would rather die than admit he was scared. The same psychological trait that had made him cross the Rubicon and chase Pompey through storms was now going to get him killed. When Caesar arrived at the Senate, he was so confident that he dismissed his bodyguards. He walked into that building like he owned it, which technically he did. But ownership doesn't stop knives. And the moment Caesar saw Brutus among the conspirators, everything clicked. According to witnesses, Caesar stopped fighting back. He pulled his toga over his head and let them finish him off. Because the one thing Caesar couldn't survive wasn't death. It was the realization that even his most trusted people wanted him gone. The conspirators stabbed Caesar 23 times, and most of the wounds weren't even fatal. It was like they were trying to make sure everyone got a piece of the action, that everyone was equally guilty. Classic conspiracy psychology. Spread the responsibility so no one person has to carry the weight of the decision. But here's the final tragic irony that the conspirators completely missed. Buckle up for the most spectacular political miscalculation in human history, because the conspirators who killed Caesar to save the Roman Republic accidentally destroyed it forever. They thought they were writing the ending of Caesar's story, but they were actually writing the prologue to the Roman Empire. Here's what Brutus and his fellow assassins completely failed to understand. Caesar alive was a politician who could be defeated, negotiated with, or outlasted. Caesar dead became something infinitely more dangerous. A martyr, a symbol, and a rallying cry for everyone who wanted to finish what he started. The moment Caesar died, his adopted son Octavian, later known as Augustus, inherited not just Caesar's name and wealth, but his entire political mythology. And Octavian was everything Caesar was, but smarter, more patient, and absolutely ruthless about learning from Caesar's mistakes. The conspirators expected the Roman people to celebrate Caesar's death as liberation from tyranny. Instead, they got riots. Caesar's funeral turned into the ancient equivalent of a revolution, with crowds demanding vengeance against the assassins. The people didn't see Caesar as a dictator who'd been justly killed. They saw him as their champion who'd been murdered by jealous elites. And here's where Caesar's genius for propaganda paid off even after death: his will. Caesar left money to every Roman citizen and donated his private gardens to the city as public parks. Even dead, he was still buying the people's loyalty and making his enemies look petty and selfish. But the real master stroke was what happened to Caesar's body. When they cremated him in the Forum, something unprecedented occurred. The crowd threw everything they could find onto the funeral pyre. Furniture, jewelry, weapons, even musical instruments. The fire burned so hot and bright that people could see it from miles away. Real talk. Tell me in the comments if you think this was spontaneous grief or if Octavian orchestrated the whole thing, because the political theater here is almost too perfect to be accidental. Within 2 years, Octavian had hunted down and killed every single conspirator. Brutus and Cassius committed suicide rather than face capture. The liberators of the Republic died as fugitives and outcasts, while Caesar's heir systematically dismantled everything they'd tried to preserve. And then Octavian did something that would have made Caesar proud. He kept all of Caesar's power while pretending to restore the Republic. He called himself first citizen instead of dictator, maintained the Senate as a ceremonial body, and convinced everyone he was just a humble public servant, all while being more powerful than Caesar ever was. The Roman Republic was dead, but nobody wanted to admit it. Octavian ruled for 45 years as Emperor Augustus, founding a dynasty that would control the Mediterranean for centuries. And he did it all while claiming he was honoring Caesar's memory and preserving Roman traditions. So what's the real story they're hiding about Julius Caesar? It's not that he was a hero or a villain, it's that he was a preview of everything wrong with modern politics. Caesar proved that democracy is vulnerable to anyone charismatic enough to convince people that rules don't apply to them, that institutions are just obstacles to overcome, and that personal loyalty matters more than public service. Caesar showed the world how to destroy a republic from the inside while making it look like salvation. He demonstrated that people will cheer for authoritarianism if you package it as protecting them from their enemies. And most terrifyingly, he proved that political systems don't die from external threats. They die when ambitious people learn to weaponize the system's own weaknesses against itself. The conspirators killed Caesar, but they couldn't kill what he represented. And 2,000 years later, we're still dealing with politicians who've learned Caesar's lessons about power, propaganda, and the dangerous psychology of the crowd. What do you think? Was Caesar a genius who saved Rome from chaos, or a sociopath who destroyed the world's greatest democracy for his own ego? Let me know in the comments, because honestly, after diving this deep into his story, I'm not sure the distinction matters anymore. The real Julius Caesar wasn't hiding behind some conspiracy or cover-up. He was hiding in plain sight, showing us exactly who he was and what he was willing to do. We just chose to turn him into a legend instead of learning from the warning. And that might be the scariest truth of all. Smash that like button if this completely changed how you think about ancient history, and subscribe, because there's so much more insane stuff that schools never teach you. Seriously, history is way more twisted than any fiction you've ever read, and we're just getting started. What other historical figures do you want me to expose next? Drop your suggestions below, and remember, question everything they taught you in school, because the real stories are always way more interesting than the sanitized versions. See you in the next one, history buffs.